And thanks for tuning into Morning Live. Now, the increase in the country's unemployment announced by Stats SA this week, followed by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni's bombshell on the national debt, which could exceed 70% of the country's GDP in the next 3 years, paints a really bleak picture of a country with a depressed economy. And talking about e-tolls in his medium-term budget speech, Minister Mboweni emphasized the importance of paying for e-tolls, saying that the user pay principle is here to stay. But he was contradicted by Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula yesterday, who said a final decision still needs to be taken. So Dr Piet Croucamp, political analyst and senior lecturer at the Northwest University, is here to help us take a look at some of the stories that made the headlines this week as we analyze and unpack them. Thanks for coming through, Dr Croucamp. Where to start? Okay, let's start with what we are expecting today, ratings agencies, and we had the midterm budget's policy statement this week, and it didn't make for good listening.
If we're doing well today, the outlook is lowered to negative. That's if we're doing really well. It is quite possible. It doesn't happen often. I think 1 out of every 100 times it will happen that they downgrade you right past the outlook and we become downgraded as well. Remember, Moody's is the only of the ratings agencies that still have us at investment grade. I just have to qualify that. We have a foreign debt and then national debt. Only 10% of our total debt of around about 3 trillion rand is foreign debt. The rest are all local debt. It means we owe money to local institutions. If we are downgraded, the banks might just go with us.
And we can't afford that.
Of course we can't afford it. We will have an investment conference very, very soon. How do you convince people to come and invest in economy that has just been downgraded? And the very things that the ratings agencies and the World Bank told us that we need to do just to keep our investment grading, those very things will be the things that people who invest money, who want to invest or could invest money in South Africa, they will ask exactly the same questions before they bring another cent. I've spoken to a rather large mining house just the other day. They said to me they maintain what they have in South Africa, but they will not sink another shaft in the next 10 to 15 years. Because even if you do get the green light and the right policies in place, it still takes another 10 years for them to really set things up to sink a shaft. And that's not going to happen anytime soon. So
I've heard similar stories from would-be investors into this country. And it then begs the question, as you said, we have another investor conference next week. The president has appointed envoys. The president has called summit after summit. What are we actually trying to do here when we say South Africa is open for business, but then when people try to invest, they are, met with all sorts of bureaucratic red tape?
Yeah, it takes 47 days to open a business in South Africa. If you to bring money into South Africa to start a business is really, really difficult. But the first sign for me that we are heading towards a point where it's possible for people to bring money from the outside into South Africa will be when the South African economy is reinvesting in itself. We are a net exporter of investment capital. In other words, we invest more in other countries than we invest in our own country. That's got to do with the idea of trust. The moment people with money start trusting the local economy, they will invest here. It makes much more sense to invest in your local market quite often. That is if you trust the decision makers, you trust policy, you trust the government, you trust the governing party, you trust the opposition parties, you trust the institutional mechanisms which has to regulate the economy. Once you start trusting the economy at large, it's possible that people will start investing, or people with money will start to invest here, and they don't do it. So foreigners will tell you, what is it that South Africans know that we don't know? Why don't they invest in their own economy? The same thing happened, by the way, in China now. There's a lot of outflow out of capital, a lot of investment abroad. For some reason, the Chinese don't invest in an economy that grows around about 6%. Well, the question is, what do the Chinese know that we don't know? And I think the answer there lies with their financial system. But in any case, that's another topic.
It certainly is. But what needs to happen? What does government need to do to convince local business to invest? Business leadership's Busi Mavuso, the president, was here yesterday, and I asked her about that. 1.3 trillion rand is what our business, South African private business, is sitting on in cash reserves. Why are they not investing that?
Well, they will tell you the cost of doing business. the cost of labor in South Africa, and that's a contentious point. Just remember, the average wage for around about 50% of formally employed people in South Africa is between 3,500 Rand and 3,800 Rand. Now we've set the minimum wage at 3,500 Rand. Do you think there's any incentive for anybody to employ any person if the minimum wage and the average wage of the formally employed is exactly the same almost? There's no incentive. We're the only country in the world that has experimented with that social project. And don't take it from me, Harvard professor Ricardo Hausmann, who was advisor to Graham Motlanthe in the ANC. He himself warned them, you cannot set your minimum wage and the average wage for the formally employed almost at exactly the same level. There's no incentive for anybody to employ people below that. And our problem is that's exactly where we have the most unemployed people. And unless we make laws or change policies which makes it viable for anybody to employ that class of workers, we will always be in serious problem. And then, of course, the other things we can do, we can make it easier for expertise to come in, because a lot of expertise leaves South Africa, very little coming in. We can make it easy. There are low-hanging fruit that the president has been threatening for a year now to do, like changing the visa regulations, making it easier for people with expertise coming into South Africa. This is low-hanging fruit, and it takes him a year to do that. And this, you just raised the question about the e-tolls, the battle between the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Transport, and perhaps even the President somewhere in the mix. If the Cabinet can't agree about something as simple as that, how do you think they can agree, Minister Pravin Gordhan with very hardcore ideas himself, how do you think they're going to agree about anything in terms of policy in South Africa? It's going to be very difficult. There's a lack of leadership in Cabinet. Not only in South Africa, a lack of leadership in Cabinet. I think the finger is starting to point at the President. It's time that he set his foot down, decide what has to be done, and get his ministers to toe the line, and they must speak with a single voice. It sounds like everybody in Cabinet has got the authority to speak on policies that divert quite significantly from each other.
Let's talk to e-tolls since, we're there. So, the Minister of Finance saying, listen, the user pay principle is here to stay. Everybody will pay for using these roads that have been tolled. The Finance Minister, and this, of course, one would imagine on the back of election promises that were made. The people of Gauteng, we heard the Premier, David Makura, and now the Minister of Finance obviously also coming back on that, because there was an undertaking given to the citizens of Gauteng that this was something that the African National Congress would look into. So what needs to be done with the e-tolls?
They now have to make a decision. Remember, at the time, there was all sorts of accusations against Sanral, that there was corruption, that it's a foreign company involved, it's in Austria. All those things are important, all those things are true. But now a decision must be made about, well, how are we going to solve this bill? Who will pay this bill? And I think Tito is right. The user must pay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, if it is quite possible for the government to sit down, to lay down the law and say, we will pay this debt off, because it's added debt to government's debt. We will pay it off, and we will pay it off in the following way, and then make the laws to force people to pay. There is no escape from paying the toll fees. I think they put up the wrong system. If you allow people to drive through and pay later, you are in trouble. Ask Edgar's. They also couldn't collect their money. There must be another system, a system implemented that force people to pay. Because quite honestly, the argument that it's an electoral point of contention. The fact is, the ANC in Gauteng cannot lay down specific principles and laws that overrules that of national government. The Constitution doesn't allow it, and certainly you can't make electoral promises which you will then later try to make national promises.
But they are, I would imagine, caught between a rock and a hard place, because if you look at the number of toll gates across the country, the majority of those through this system are in Gauteng. So the Gauteng user essentially is billed several times, because if you go to work, when I come to work, I drive through a few of these gantries. And if someone drives in, if you are coming from the northwest, for example, and you drive in here, are you paying?
Of course you pay.
But when do we get you to pay?
Exactly the same system applies. They get a bill and they must pay it. I think the question that some people ask sometimes is that why do we in Gauteng have to pay tolls here, And then when people from other provinces, they use the road, but they're not continuously burdened with that.
Exactly.
Okay, but the user pay principle means if you've used this road, if you've driven along this road, then you pay because you've driven along this road. It doesn't matter where you come from. And whether you live in Cape Town or in Eastern Cape or Gauteng, you get a bill and you better pay it. And I think Tito is right on that. If we can't get South Africans to do this, remember they already made the provision that poor people, taxis don't pay e-tolls. So you're talking about the middle class, the black and the white middle class of Gauteng has to pay their taxes and they refuse to do it.
But isn't this the middle class that's already overburdened? This middle class is saddled with everything.
But the poor is even worse off. The poor is even worse off. Everybody is in a desperate state in South Africa. If we always have that argument and the reason why we're not paying, we don't pay our electricity because of apartheid, we don't pay the toll rolls because there was corruption at Sanral. We will find reasons not to pay any taxes and we will literally drag the government under the water.
And this is perhaps the nub of the matter for the South African middle class, because the South African middle class is saddled with the debt for everything. When you look at the number of tax-paying South Africans, inevitably the middle class makes up the bulk of that once again. You are subsidizing what poor people get through that a social wage that government has entered into with its citizens. Then you have to pay, unfortunately, middle-class people have to pay bonds, because you fall through the cracks when it comes to the provision of housing. You fall through the cracks in just about everything. So you're paying for a bond, you're paying medical aid, you're paying for the education of your children because they go to schools where they don't have the no-fee provisions, unfortunately, most of the time. And there's quite a few hoops that you have to jump through. So this middle-class person, through paying for all of that, still has to pay for all the losses incurred at your state-owned entities, because that's a debt that has to be paid, and you are going to pay for it once again.
Okay, the debt and the corruption there, that's almost a separate issue. The fact is, if you're middle class, you are extremely privileged. White middle class and black middle class people in South Africa, compared to many, many other countries in the world, live an utter privileged life. So yes, we carry most of the debt burden, and some of that debt is then used for social services for poor people. And why should it be different? That should be exactly like that. That happens.
But how can you say the middle class is privileged, Dr. Croucamp, if you are literally 1 or 2 paychecks away from poverty?
The next person is in poverty.
Yes, but how privileged are you?
If you are 2 paychecks away from poverty, you are extremely privileged. Most people in South Africa are already in poverty.
But they are in debt. The middle class is in debt. It's not as if they have a lot of disposable income.
And I quote my friend, my economist Mike Schuessler here, comparably the middle class in South Africa have less debt than most other middle classes in developing economies and even in some developed economies.
Who is Mike Schuessler polling? Because I would love to see a survey. I'd love to see a study where the middle class is actually surveyed in terms of how far in debt they are.
Do you see how a middle class person is protesting paying his dues? Do you see the problem that Tito Mboweni has? And he doesn't get the president's support to come down on you like a ton of bricks and force you to pay, because that's what you should be doing. You're middle class.
Force me to pay for what more? Because I am paying as I go.
You must pay for what you use. I hope you pay your e-tolls. You must pay for e-tolls. You must pay for electricity. You must pay for your water. You must pay for the services you get.
I don't have an option but to pay.
I hope
because
so.
I get shut off if I don't pay.
It's
as simple as that.
I hope
it
so.
gets cut off.
I hope so.
So let's talk about Eskom very quickly.
Yeah.
And what's happening at Eskom. We heard of political interference, and of course they're struggling with the turnaround there.
Well, 10, 15 years ago, if the minister pronounced a new policy that's contrary to, say, what the unions at Eskom would like, there was a strike, there was 1 million COSATU workers in the street, and the minister had to review his issues or discuss it at NETLAC with the unions. So there was a formal process, a procedure. Things have changed. If the minister implements a policy which says 15,000 workers at Eskom must be declared redundant, the next morning the country is dark, not because the workers will go on strike, but the workers will sabotage the system. In the same way that the trains in the Western Cape are sabotaged by people. That is the new way of protesting government policy. And that comes at a much higher price. Have you noticed that not a single person was prosecuted for burning trains in the Western Cape? Have you noticed that not a single person is prosecuted for destroying property at Eskom? Because it's very difficult to do that. And it's almost impossible the government finds it. So if the government says tomorrow, we do what we have to do, what the ratings agencies want us to do, the next day, this place is dark. There's no light for you to work in because of sabotage. Sabotage have taken the place of protesting.
Well, that's where we have to leave it. Thank you so much, Dr. Piet Croucamp, Senior Lecturer at the Northwest University, also political analyst, analyzing some of the week's big stories.